All right, so I found this file, and within that file, I found a story I had completely. I don't remember writing this story. I have no idea where it came from. I remember as I haven't read it out loud, obviously. I've kind of scanned it here, and I can guess the time frame in which this was written, but it's one of the many that were a lot of stories that were. This file was full of aborted novels and stories I began but didn't finish for whatever reason, and this was one of the ones that were actually finished all the way through. And it's called Nature, and it's kind of dark, and I'll just read it, and this will make episode 3 of Garbage on Water B-Sides, a series dedicated to the pieces and stories and maybe even novel excerpts that just didn't make the cut for whatever reason. Sometimes I would get an idea and I would just go, and then all of a sudden it would just like dry up, run dry. That was it. Like a switch would flip, and I just lost interest in the story. And I don't know why either. I just knew I was going to run out of gas anyway, or I just realized that I wanted to write, and I was just saying nothing, which is my favorite kind of writing. So, but at the same time, I decided to walk off, and this is one of those, and maybe I will do something with this, actually. Maybe I'll do something. Maybe I'll put this in a collection I send off and for the final edit, and maybe it'll make it. I definitely think a lot of these need a hard rewrite and a hard edit. But anyway, this is Nature. She thought about how they used to stand at life's forefront, where the lemon yellow fields broke open and shined. They'd watch the colors of morning from their backyard, and the colors shone upon the walnut trees and through the orange blossoms. Her men had a good job and a good laugh. They'd married young and had no children. She remembered it as a series of small events. Each of them had come from nowhere and piled upon each other. Each of them had connected and usurped happiness. Each of them were single threads joining over time, and they had grown into one collective darkness and become too heavy to ride upon the wind. That's what she remembered. 13 years later, they faced the morning together in St. Francis Park, and the workers across the street of the hardware store sat in the stoop before the doors were opened, and they watched the couple unfold their wet bedding and drape it over the bench. Layla once had her looks. She once wore her skin like jewelry. She fell for Mavis all those years ago when Mavis was a strong man. She watched him pull an old cigarette from his baggie. At night they walked the storefronts of Laurelhurst and collected them from the cans and ashtrays. He lit up and cracked his neck, took a long hit, and closed his eyes. The workers across the street watched them every morning. They knew Layla would turn her socks inside out and put them back on. She did, and Mavis walked over and put the smoke in her mouth. The workers flicked their own cigarettes out into the street and followed the owner inside. Mavis sat next to his wife. His hip still bumped hers playfully. She never understood why that remained, but little constants like that kept her mind off the fear. She fought every morning against it, just as he did, but the fight hadn't been fair since the results were announced to them by a doctor who took pleasure in delivering bad news. Mavis put his arm around her and walked her behind the bars and swings, where mothers no longer took their children, where the police no longer noticed early in the morning. He cooked up a large hit and ran her up there, and she watched the leaves and waited for the coursing to peak. Layla loved the leaves. The bright summer sky of Portland outlined them and gave them souls. The leaves and the branches, even those that broke in the winter rain, would have life return to them in summer. Layla knew her soul was destroyed. It had been destroyed by her man. Both of them were on the streets and had been for 6 years, both of them dying. Mavis cooked up another hit and shot it. Layla hung her head and started bawling. It was a horrible sound. Mavis held her. "Come on, babyface. Shit, it won't be that bad." She grabbed his hand and cried into it. He rested his hand on her skull. "Look, I told you, we're gonna know when it's gonna happen, and before it does, I'll make sure we're so fixed up we won't feel a fucking thing. We'll jump up and take that cocksucker's hand and laugh all the way through." He rubbed her chin. "There ain't gonna be no pain." Through sunset and rape, they'd stuck together. Through every climax of life, through every restraint, crescendo and alleyway, they were blood now, and the failing sky which befouled them, the summer monsoons of death, though deserts away to the south knew their name. She was dead there. Her man was dead there, and death only spared the deceased. Time was their master on this crucial level. Layla sat back and watched the park. Blankets and bargain, miles of highway and hot foil were their stairways to the stars now. Behind them, the stairs stood crooked and angry. The noise of life was dulled to a hum behind traffic and whistles. The sunsets were cold and inhuman. The nights were borrowed and ugly, disfigured by addiction and filth. Layla stuck by her man. She had no family. Mavis had a brother, but he was deep into the church, and Mavis had a strong hatred for God. Layla stuck by him while knowing this, even though her God wouldn't spit on her anymore. He wouldn't show her the way to hell. He wouldn't grace her with any type of acknowledgement. When she died with her man, they would rot together without the mercy of time. Abandoned by faith, they moved, past the park and onto 12th Avenue. The people of Portland reenacted summer like horror. Layla and Mavis had started out in Texas, where the heat was layered with sweat and flies. Layla watched his hands steer the cart, and she remembered the flies again, larger than roaches. The flies landed and bit out there. When she and Mavis were children, fostered from separate hells out of poverty and under the same roof in Richardson, their new parents took them to Illinois to visit their relatives. Layla met Mavis while living in foster care. She was 13. Mavis was 15. Their foster family was loving. The father had worked in and out of finance, and the mother had worked with him. They had fostered children over 3 decades of marriage. The mother was unable to bear children, and the husband wasn't able to watch his wife crumble under the wings of sterility. They took in abandoned children and even loved them. Their home was more than Layla's real home had ever been. Both she and Mavis were products of rape and impoverished households. Layla's father was perpetually drunk, and he raped her repeatedly from the age of 6 to 13. He ruptured her away from eternity and extinguished cigarettes across her chest. Mavis's mother, an alcoholic, molested him under the guiltlessness of being a blackout drunk. Yet, Layla and Mavis carried the distinct trait of self-forgiveness and understanding that they had no control of their youth. Layla caught a break when her mother caught her father in the act, and Mavis was caught by his brother catching their mother in the act. They had shared the bond of travel and displacement separately. Now they were dying together. Layla fell for Mavis on the road to Illinois. They weren't fond of the relatives there. The relatives were rich and unkind. They treated the stepchildren as pariahs, freeloaders who ate from wealthy plates and slept across freshly laundered sheets and pillows, all the while deserving the gutters and kitchens fate had designed for them. They took a walk around the block of Elk Grove. It was Christmas 1993. Kennedy had just been destroyed and his ghost hung over every corner. They walked the neighborhood, waist-deep in fireflies. Layla listened as Mavis broke down their anatomy. He explained that the flies weren't flies but beetles, and the fire wasn't fire at all but a cold chemical process used to attract mates. Layla remembered this while she and Mavis walked south down 12th toward the Aladdin Theater, then through the soiled eyes of Selwood, rotted with expensive storefronts, rotted with soft skin and new cars. The people dining on the sidewalk tables of Milwaukee glanced them over and stared into each other. Their death was visible now, especially in Layla. Her face was alight with lesions. Mavis had them across his torso. There were free clinics and centers which guided their conditions into generous death, but they had decided to die away from them. The heroin helped. The money for the heroin was made in half a day's begging. One look at Layla's face, blighted by disease and shame, even from the most hardened cynic, inspired generosity. The heroin in Portland was garbage. Mavis had started out by smoking it behind the bars of Dallas. He tried to ease off by chasing the dragon, which is how he introduced it to Layla. She'd inhale the smoke from the foil for a few years before they started with the needles. The needles meant a harder rush. A harder rush demanded a harder lull, and that demanded more heroin to chase the old rush. The addiction became unfriendly when Mavis sold her car. Layla had no power over any of it. Mavis sold his own car. The rest of their things promptly followed, rings and all. His brother put them on a plane to Seattle to stay with the brethren family of his church, but Seattle only led to the market, and the market led them to the alleys beneath it, and that led them to quality heroin, which only bled them of their small bankroll his brother had given him, and that led them back to garbage. Mavis wound up stealing from the house in which they were living, a house full of small, rare, expensive things. The people in the house held an intervention, with the presence of Mavis's brother and his wife, who flew to Seattle for the weekend to lead it. They agreed to check in a treatment, sat through a long group prayer, and escaped the house before sunrise, taking with them 3 Persian rugs and a bag full of ancient wares. With that money, they jumped a Greyhound south to Portland, fell into another crowd of junkies that lived in a warehouse. There they stole from stores and ran, sold the things and passed needles with the people in the warehouse. Layla became ill and pale for a few weeks. Her hands were sore and her cough was sickening. Mavis took her to the free clinic. Blood was drawn from each of them, and 3 weeks later they sat in front of a doctor who mechanically told them they were at the end of the virus, and they were pretty much dead. 3 months had passed since the news. The park had been their purgatory, and they were walking south again. Mavis pushed their lives across the streets. Layla walked beside him as society walked beyond them. Sometimes Layla saw it the other way. They had walked beyond society. They were leaving the human race in graceless retreat. She felt it in the air between them and the ground beneath them. Their shoes were almost gone, and the warm sidewalks of Portland offered little warmth, but rather a hiss of complete and total death. Mavis was less open about his fears. He knew if there was a hell, doubtful as it seemed to him. He knew he had a strong front seat, and he knew his wife would be beside him, not because she was evil, but because he had made her evil. They'd never been to jail or even detained for walking the streets and sleeping where they hid. They had been stopped regularly, but the hard reality was even a cop didn't want to touch them. They slept behind old industry past Selwood, and in the night Layla was sick to the point of immobility. Her breaths were short and her heart was in a slow, disgusting rhythm. Mavis put his ear to her heart, and he heard it dying. The ocean was far and without time. He set her in the cart and covered her, and walked the cart far down the side roads of McLaughlin Boulevard. They cut through neighborhoods and unpaved walkways until they reached Old 82nd, where he pushed her to Carver Lake, talking to her and sometimes singing. She was fixed up to the point of painlessness. He wondered if they should feel the sunrise. Then he remembered his life, all of it, in one glance at the dark water, and he held his wife in his arms. She was convulsive and saturated. Her brain had miles ago slipped into the throes of death, and with that awful change she'd felt calm, and she knew she'd been afraid for nothing. She knew she was in his arms, and she felt his lips touch hers, and the water from the lake touched her spine and wrapped around his arms. She could feel his slow steps through the crest of the lake, his lips upon hers, his arms holding her in the water which had swallowed them with a sudden drop-off. She felt them sinking weightless, and her feet again dangled like a child's, and the kiss of her man was warm and close. There was no last glance of moonlight through the surface, no sudden crossover into a brilliant white world, no wondering if she would feel the bottom of the lake. Her last thought had been a feeling of pride in her man that he'd kept his promises. And that concludes episode 3 of Garbage on Water, B-Sides. heartwarming story there. But yeah, I have no recollection of writing this. I kind of know, I can kind of, I guess, take a stab at the time frame in which this was written, but even that's a shot in the dark. But, okay, well, I'm going to get out of here. Thank you for listening, and I really appreciate it. So I will get this done, loaded, and walk the pups in reverse order, and get more coffee first and foremost. So, as always, take good care.